welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. Brazil's presidential election has thrown up a cliffhanger. President Jair Bolsonaro and left-wing former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva will head for a runoff in October. Negotiations for a ceasefire in Yemen continue past deadline, and after a Thailand court ruling, Prayut Chan-o-cha can remain Prime Minister till the next election. All this in our latest episode of Daily Debrief. It wasn't as clear a verdict as some polls had predicted. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva secured a 5% lead in the presidential polls held Sunday in Brazil. The left-wing former president is just short of the 50% votes he needs to topple extreme right-wing Jair Bolsonaro's government. A lot hangs in the balance for Brazil, the fourth largest economy. After repeated economic and social shocks over 4 years, people are watchful of the incumbent president. But what happens next? Let's talk to Prashant from People's Dispatch. Prashant, what's the update we have from Brazil?
Right, very complicated election, very interesting election. So, the first obvious update is the fact, like you mentioned, that Lula has a substantial lead. He's got over 48%, which means he was just 1.6% odd short, 1.63% odd short from getting the majority he needed to win in the first round itself. For the first round, you needed to get 50% plus one vote, as they say. So he was very close to getting the first round victory. So that part is not a surprise, because that was something all the polls had predicted, the voter intention surveys had predicted in the past.
Right.
What has been surprising is the fact that Jair Bolsonaro, the incumbent president, the right-wing candidate who was supposed to get somewhere in the mid-30s in terms of percentages, has got 43%. And that was a substantial lead considering, and that's a substantial surge considering, not lead, sorry, surge considering what was expected, because all the polls uniformly showed him to be somewhere between 33 and 36, 37%. So as far as Bolsonaro is concerned, it's a very good performance, and it sort of, and it brings the race into a much more challenging one ahead of the second round, which we'll come to later. In terms of the other results, it's been overall not a bad night for the right wing. They've done decent. They've done pretty well, actually, in a number of states, for the state governorships, for instance. They, of course, also have a considerable advantage in parliament as well, which is also, going to be trouble for Lula if he's elected in the second round, which looks likely, of course. But the big question in everyone's mind really has been, how did Bolsonaro sort of reach 43%. So we did speak to some Brazilian political analysts who pointed out that one of the possibilities could have been the fact that the votes of the third and fourth standing candidates, many of their voters could have ended up, the centrist or right-wing supporters could have ended up supporting Bolsonaro instead. Whereas many had thought that these voters might just vote for Lula towards the end, to avoid a second rounder, because Lula was so much in the lead, they would have thought, let's just vote for the winning candidate. But that didn't clearly happen. So while the last exit poll, I believe, opinion survey did predict that they would get around 11% of the vote, together they've got just 7% of the vote. Right. So that's one explanation. It's also possible, for instance, that many Bolsonaro supporters did not respond to these opinion voting intention surveys, or because Bolsonaro has also run a campaign where he sort of criticized these surveys, called them inaccurate, etc., etc. So his supporters may not have, taken part, in some of those surveys. But an important thing to note is that he does have a considerable support base. I think ahead of the elections, that was a big question, because in the international media and in the Brazilian media, his failures have been so obvious that many have wondered whether he had any support at all. But the fact is that he does have a very solid bloc behind him. There's no doubt about that. So all these are important factors to sort of consider. Now, the other question really is what is going to happen in the second round. How the alliances will work. But of course, one more important thing to note is that if you look at the breakup of the votes they received, it's quite interesting to see that more of the rural and poorer areas voted for Lula, whereas the more wealthier southwest parts of the country, the economic centers, for instance, Bolsonaro had a substantial amount of support.
Okay.
Right, so that's also important. In some big cities, maybe Lula had much more support, but in the region as a whole, Bolsonaro had a much greater support where he was very well off. So that's broadly where we are at right now.
Okay, Prashant, but two very different kinds of Brazils imagined by both these contesting candidates. Can you just talk about what either of them represent?
Right, so I think the next 3 to 4 weeks we're going to see exactly that. We're going to see these two visions which are very different, competing directly, because now a lot of the state elections are over. There will be some which go into the second round as well, because everywhere the rule is the same for governorships also. If you don't cross 50%, there's a runoff, right? So, for instance, Sao Paulo, one of the most significant contexts, Fernando Haddad, who was also, according to the opinion polls, in the lead, ended up trailing. So there'll be a lot of those elections, but the Lula versus Bolsonaro dynamic is going to be the center of attention in the next few weeks as well. So that's going to be very interesting. And Lula has, which also reflects, like I said, in the support, Lula has talked about bridging the inequality gap. He's talked about improving healthcare. He's talked about saving the environment. He's talked about unemployment as a major issue. And all these are very significant campaign planks that he'll be trying to hit. Bolsonaro, on the other hand, of course, will be trying to bank on his record. In recent times, he has passed some measures, ahead of the elections to sort of bolster up support. There's a lot of anti-Lula campaigning that he's also done. Both candidates have been very harsh on each other, but especially Bolsonaro has, continuously raked up the supposed issue of Lula's corruption, which he was acquitted for, and which everywhere is widely known that it was a politically concocted case. But in terms of, so Bolsonaro's campaign is also likely to sort of work on that mobilization. He has a lot of support from certain sections of the evangelical population. He has a lot of support from the agribusiness sector. So he's going to try to use and mobilize all of these and really keep, hitting on that campaign of how the left is going to cause chaos and anarchy in Brazil if they come to power. That's been a big plank of his as well. How the left is completely, is so dangerous for the country, etc., etc. So we're going to see a lot of these kind of campaigning taking place. One big question on everyone's mind is basically how Bolsonaro is going to respond to the second round itself. Now, a lot of people did observe or did give the opinion that if Lula did win in the first round, it would not give Bolsonaro too much of an opportunity to talk about his favorite slogans of election fraud, of the voting machines being unreliable, etc., etc. Okay. But now that the margin is very close and it's going to go into a second round election, there's going to be a lot more of concern on this issue. So it's no surprise that reporters are asking Bolsonaro time and again, will you accept the result? And Bolsonaro's general refrain usually is, I will accept a fair result, etc., etc. So that's something to watch out for. It's a bit of a concern for many voters, many analysts in Brazil on how the incumbent president has responded to this question. So that's also a key concern. But what we're going to see is probably a very polarized campaign coming up in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
With people on the edge for at least another month
right
now. Okay, Prashant, thanks a lot for joining us. New concerns have deadlocked the warring factions in Yemen from extending a ceasefire signed in April. The ceasefire meant relative peace and more essential supplies for Yemeni people. The airport in the capital Sana'a opened to international flights, more fuel shipments arrived at Hodeidah port, and violence reduced significantly. But as the October 2 deadline expired, attempts were still on to keep scaling down hostilities. We'll go to Abdul from People's Dispatch. Abdul, what are the points on which this agreement could not come through so far?
As per the reports in media, it is primarily the three major, you can say, the issues. Of course, one issue raised by the Saudi-backed coalition, and other issues were raised by the Houthis primarily. The Houthis were raising since April that there is a need to address these two issues. The issues related to the oil wealth, which is being, they claim, expropriated, looted by the Saudi-backed factions. In fact, they allege that it is Saudi Arabia which is primary beneficiary of this looting of the Yemen's natural resources, and it needs to stop because without that oil wealth, which Yemen's governments cannot pay salaries for their own employees, which basically complicates the human rights situation and the total administration of the country. Apart from that, the major issue which was raised by the Houthis was related to the blockade. As you rightly mentioned, that since the ceasefire, Sana'a airport was partially open, Hodeidah port was open for humanitarian supplies, but Houthis had been raising the issue that a large number of ships carrying essential commodities like fuel and food were kind of seized by Saudi forces or Saudi-backed forces many times. They were also raising the concern of the complete opening of Sana'a airport, which is so far now, as per the agreement, only 5 flights per week are allowed. They
Right.
wanted more flights to fly from Sana'a airport. And on both these issues, blockade and the oil wealth, there was no positive outcome coming in last 6 months. And that basically from the Houthi side. From, of course, Saudi-backed coalition was raising the issue of the lifting the blockade in and around Tej city, which Houthis have their own claims, but primarily these are the 3 sticking points on which ceasefire negotiations did not move further. I think it should also be noted that there were already concerns that the ceasefire, if it continues the way it is, 2 months extension per at the expiry of the 2 months, is not a sustainable way of achieving peace in the Yemen war. And there was always a need, so we can also say that UN also has failed from its sides to basically push the parties to basically negotiate a longer peace.
Right, Abdul. Abdul, now can you talk about also what is the implications of this peace treaty which is being attempted? What would happen if it comes through or doesn't?
If it does not come through, I think there will be a resumption of the level of hostilities we were witnessing before April. It means a further loss of the Yemenis, in particular, both their life and their properties, and it basically will continue the chaos in the country and in the larger region, of course, because Yemen war destabilizes the entire region in a way. It has a repercussion with on the Saudi-Iran relationship. It has repercussion on Saudi-UAE relationship and
Right.
Yemen-UAE relationship. So if it does not come through, of course, the war will resume and the further casualties we'll see. Not good for anyone. If it comes through, of course, there is some, if we see some kind of miracle happens and there is a deal, a real deal, then of course it will lead to a situation where the much needed kind of reconstruction of the Yemen will resume. It may lead to a further de-escalation of regional hostilities. It will create a possibility for the Yemeni, the millions of Yemenis who are displaced, millions of Yemenis who are starving, partially getting fed, not getting enough medicines. They will be able to get all those basic necessities. So if there is a longer peace, and then of course it will be good for the economic health of the region, of the country, and the Yemenis, millions of Yemenis who are basically forced to sacrifice their basic economic need for war. The governments, the administration, the warring factions will be able to spare money needed for the health and economic welfare of the people. If Yemen today is the region's poorest country and one of the
Right.
world's poorest, and this the decline in Yemen, living standards in Yemen, the overall economic conditions in Yemen, as on the verge of mass starvation, is primarily due to the war. So it is obvious that if war ends, this situation will improve. The international community will also be in a better position to help the Yemenis and to recover from their misery at this moment.
Okay, Abdul, the longer the peace deal lasts, the better. Opposition parties in Thailand would feel disappointed over a recent constitutional court ruling. It allows Prayut Chan-o-cha to remain the prime minister, and it sparks concerns of mass agitations and protests. Chan-o-cha became prime minister after 2014 coup. The Thai constitution has a 8-year limit on a prime minister's term. The Thai court has ruled this limit does not apply since the constitution was changed in 2017. We go over to Anish on the implications of this ruling. Anish, so what can we expect now that he's back in power?
Well, we can definitely expect more opposition on the ground and in the parliament as well. We've already seen protests in Bangkok after the ruling. It clearly has its own set of politics. Obviously, there is definitely also the fact that the Palang Prachrat party, which supports Prayut, has now got back the phase that they sorely needed in the coming set of elections that are expected in the next year or so. So in this case, for the ruling coalition, it is kind of a godsend in many ways. Obviously, many people were expecting this kind of ruling in favor of Prayut, but even then, the Constitutional Court has always been kind of volatile in who they support and who they end up punishing. So in this case, definitely it came out in favor and for better or for worse in favor of Prayut's continued administration. So he will definitely be overseeing the ruling coalition's electoral campaign, or not just that, the expected or his planned recovery plan until the next election is also going to be set in motion, all of which is sorely needed because, as we know, opinion polling shows that its ratings have gone very down. The ruling party itself has, gone down to single-digit percentages when it comes to opinion polling. So that shows that there is definitely a large part of anti-incumbency against the government and against Prayut as well.
And we talk a little bit more about the next election. What could that mean for the government and the opposition?
Well, two ways to look at it. One is definitely the fact that the opposition is gaining a lot of ground, especially the Pheu Thai party, which is the main leading opposition party in the parliament right now, which is closely associated with the Shinawatra family. On the other, so they are definitely gaining ground. This opposition-supported candidate recently won the Bangkok the governor elections, and that was a big fillip because Bangkok was obviously for a very long time sort of a fort for the ruling coalition's Democratic Party, a very conservative pro-monarchy party. So to see that being flipped in the favor of opposition shows that there is definitely a lot of things changing on the ground. On the other hand, Prayut's government is definitely going to be on war footing to try to recover the grounds that they have lost. This is definitely a second chance that they have, and they're going to make the most use of it, especially with the recovery plan that they're trying to push for in the parliament. But more importantly, we have to look at how social movements are going to respond to and who they are going to work for in the upcoming elections. That is a major part of how things are going to move. But on the larger scale of things, if you look at it, the constitution is still very pro-military. And even if Prayut may not have, he may have something like 2 years or more in power after the next election. But that does not mean that the military is going to go out of power, because the Senate is definitely almost entirely appointed and supported by the military. So they will have upper hand in deciding who the government will be, because the Senate and the lower house has to sit together to decide on the prime minister and the cabinet. So all of these factors, even if there is going to be a popularly elected government that is for democracy or for further democratization of Thailand, it is going to be a difficult task to demilitarize the country or to push out the military coalition that exists within the system itself.
Okay, Anish, thanks a lot for joining us with that update. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. You can find more such stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and our regular updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.